Well, good evening. Thank you for braving the rain and the threat of snowpocalypse to come tonight. My name is Jay Bruce, and I am the director of the Center for Faith and Flourishing. And we have the pleasure of partnering with the Office of Christian Formation to host an event tonight with Laura Fabrycky, who spoke in chapel this morning. And so she's no stranger to you, but I'll tell you that she's a really great correspondent. In my job, you have to email with a bunch of people, and she's so personable and lively that it's really enjoyable to know that you have a treat in store for you. And I think I will say that, I mean, she was educated at Wheaton and then Virginia, and she's doing her doctorate in Belgium, and so very impressive. But one of the things I'm excited about is that I personally need to think about prayer politics and the Psalms. I think this is very timely for us as a community and also as a nation. How do we think about democratic engagement as Christians? So there are two housekeeping notes, and I have to say these or my program manager, Julia Bentley, will actually taser me, so I better get them right. The first is we will take questions via Slido, and the number is 835-767. So 835-767. So it's 835 and then the palindrome 767. If you forget that, don't worry, I'll remind you of 835-767, but it's always nice if you hear something provocative, you can punch out your question on your phone at 835-767. The second is, though, of course, you are here merely and only for the goods intrinsic to the practice. If you happen also to want chapel credit, then there will be a sign-up sheet with Julia Bentley will meet you through that door to sign up for chapel credit. So I think, are those my two announcements? Yeah, so well done. So JBU, let's welcome Laura as she comes to talk to us. Thank you.
It's really a treat to be with you. This room is cool. It has a really nice feel to it. And thank you again, thank you for coming out. And when we were having our little huddle over there, we were acknowledging that there is some value to listening to someone sort of make their way and try to figure something out. So a couple of just disclaimers is that I have written something that I will probably actually read to you, which will feel uncomfortable and a little unentertaining. I will plan to make some quips, because I might be like, oh, and I wanted to say this about that. So I would prefer to feel like we're kind of engaged together and I'm looking at your faces and seeing your eyes and that kind of a thing, but I might turn away and then I'm gonna re-engage with you like that. So if you can hang with that, cool. And then the other thing is, I have never used something like this before. I said the word CD in chapel this morning. I'm doing a lot of learning on the fly and in front of people, and I also put this PowerPoint together this afternoon because I was like, I should probably have some pictures. So I'm going to keep moving with it, and in fact, would you mind if to see it? Oh, no, we're recording. I'm gonna stay right here. Nope, I'm not gonna. Where is it? Is there a?
Did you shuffle around and you can follow her?
No.
Yeah, just go wherever you want to.
You sure?
Yeah.
Because then I can.
Thumbs up.
Okay, so then I can just maybe stand here so I can look more in the light. Thanks. Low light. Okay.
So you may not be looking up, but you'll be moving around the stage.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so thanks for understanding all that. I really appreciate your flexibility. So tonight's talk is better described as a meditative sketch rather than a procession of ironclad arguments. preparing to speak to you all tonight has given me a chance to rev my intellectual engines a little bit, and this is a bit of an excuse right at the beginning. Our family was living in Belgium up until about 6 months ago. My husband actually had to leave before our family did, so I was single parenting in Belgium and trying to keep pace with my doctoral studies and while preparing to do an international move. It was a lot. And so I actually paused my studies so that I could not go crazy, and I'm picking them back up tomorrow as a paying student. So I have really been out of the things that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and so this was it was a real opportunity for me to get back into it. Let's just say I didn't rev my engine, I changed the oil. Let's put it like that. I am studying in a school called the Evangelical Theological Faculty in Leuven, and my proposed topic of doctoral study in systematics and Christian ethics has centered around the question of acedia, or as actually my table mate tonight at dinner said, Acadia. You could pronounce it that way too. You sometimes see it A-K-E-D-I-A, or it could be acedia as well. In democratic political community. That is not a terribly common term, although I think it is a nearly universally experienced sensation in life, and that folks who study and write about acedia or Acadia usually have to do some historical narration to ground the term. You'd have to kind of know where it came from and who are some of the key people involved in it. And they also often have to do some definitional wrestling with it because it's old and it's had quite a journey in its meaning. One researcher said it's a word so pregnant with meaning that it frustrates every attempt to translate it. I think that overstates the case, but it's enough to say that it's a concept that is notoriously slippery. So like them, I'm going to name a few folks from church history, just a wee, not a lot, just a wee bit, and then trace some of the interpretive journey of that term. That's going to come closer to the end, and so you might be like, what was this about? Like that, I address it near the end. Now, to say something about democratic political community, it's my deliberately awkward construction that tries to account for the many arenas of shared political deliberation and action that we find in the world, not only in American national politics, even though that's the noisiest and the most despairing. I'm very much interested in conversations around the deterioration of democratic life, and most of those are not new. So it could be in conversations about the increasing rot of civic dispositions and heart habits in the civic space, like we might hear from the late sociologist Robert Bellah and his work on habits of the heart, political scientist Robert Putnam, or who wrote the book Bowling Alone, and he's written a lot of other really interesting stuff on this question, and the writer Alan Ehrenholt. I'm also interested in threats to institutions, practices, and norms as documented by people like Larry Diamond, or in measurements from institutions like Freedom House, who measure democracy and some of its indicators, or in true political collapse, as we might describe the collapse of the democratic enterprise, which was quite fragile in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the grip of Nazi National Socialism. We're starting to hear some more urgent entreaties from that latter camp. People that research certain indicators related to American public life. For instance, people that monitor these kinds of things for the Central Intelligence Agency that look at how other countries devolve into civil war are starting to get really scared. And there's some research about that we're showing a lot of naivete about how fast things could fall apart. There are lots of other people who are pushing back on that. So I'm interested also in that conversation. I think it's an evidence of despair. So that's that. Now to a slide. Okay, briefly, and I didn't write anything on that, so I think we sometimes hear about acedia, which is also called sloth, We think of sloth as laziness, like you're not doing enough, which would be a violation of diligence. It's not that, it's a violation of love. It is not doing what needs to be done in relationship. And it's a refusal to do it. But it is, because it is a negative, you're not doing something instead of it being like you're murdering someone. It's kind of hard to get your brain around it at times. It typically manifests as despair or despondency. It's a sensation of kind of what's the point, or, but you might hear other interpreters, like if you look at a lot of kind of popular writing, burnout and languishing, we've heard a lot of that because of the pandemic. And ennui is another, you might hear about ennui in, literature and that kind of thing. Boredom, there was like a New Yorker article in the last couple of years that was exploring boredom. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic. Margaret Talbot wrote about that. And she even refers to acedia, and she calls it's religious boredom. Like it's like religious people being bored. She didn't really get it, but she's referencing it. And I think that's part of my point, is that this is something that's out there. And I think that kind of like lots of people are aware of it. Melancholy. I want to talk about that in just a moment later on. I am particularly interested in how acedia might serve as a political diagnostic with an eye to political emotions. Or what theologically oriented political thinkers call the political affections. I'm introducing you to two people on this. Two contemporary thinkers that have used these particular terms are Martha Nussbaum of the University of Chicago and Joshua Horder, I'll show you his mugshot in just a moment, who wrote about political affections as a doctoral student of Oliver O'Donovan and is now a professor of Christian ethics at the University of Oxford. Horder engages with Nussbaum's work along with Jürgen Habermas, Roger Scruton, and O'Donovan himself. So back to Nussbaum. Among her considerable intellectual contributions, Nussbaum issues a lively account for the intelligibility of emotion in ethical knowledge and judgment-making evaluations. Chiefly in her work, Upheavals of Thought, and she also then takes up political emotions in a book of that term, Why Love Matters for Justice. Sorry, I just lost my place. She said, now I'm back on. She says that all societies need to think about the stability of their political culture over time and the security of cherished values in times of stress, and that emotions contribute to both ends. Tellingly, she expresses frustration that fascists seem to have a corner on the cause of compelling public emotion. They tend to do the liturgies in a more intense way. They really command our attention. They really get people going. They seem to have all the drama. Liberal democracies don't usually give much thought to that, and they don't usually involve a whole lot of energy in sort of the cherishing and celebrating of liberal democracy. We actually mostly hear about how dissatisfied we are with it. Nussbaum says, ceding the terrain of emotion shaping to anti-liberal forces, and liberal is, I'm sure you all know, this means it's small l, it's not liberal versus conservative, it's liberal, the identifying feature of like the individual as the political, yeah, okay, good. Love the head nods on that one. Anti-liberal forces, so let me just start that quote over for you. Ceding the terrain of emotion shaping to anti-liberal forces gives them a huge advantage in people's hearts and risks making people think of liberal values as tepid and boring. Ideally, Nussbaum says, political emotions direct people to think and even feel beyond themselves. Ideally, Nussbaum said, oh, I just read that. Sorry, feel beyond themselves to cultivate compassionate love for others. And there's somebody, she might not, yeah, there's the compassionate, thank you. Compassionate love for others and to help keep at bay dark lurking instincts that violate others in fearful attempts to protect ourselves. Horder, there he is. Horder affirms many of Nussbaum's insights about the rationality of our emotions, that they have an intelligence, that they matter to liberal democratic political community. He demonstrates, I think, compellingly that affections have a cognitive aptitude whereby they become enduring features of shared political reasoning. Emotions mark important evaluative beginnings that can be shared with others. We tend to want to talk about what we feel with others. And in that sharing together, we can begin to see the accrual of shared reasoning. We deliberate with one another. Oh, this is what I think about what you're feeling. Oh, this is what I think about what you're feeling, right? What marks it as political is that we're not doing it alone, and we discover our commonalities, even discovering possibly shared burdens and possible solutions in what he would call the half-light of emotions. It's sort of the beginning, or half-light of reasoning, that emotions are a kind of half-light of reasoning. Hordern considers how God cultivated political affections by means of festivals. Do I have a festival? Let's go there. By means of festivals in the life of the nation of Israel. After the Exodus, the Israelites were commanded to practice festivals of joy and to cultivate responsibility for their affections as well as their memories. He was tending their memories, which enabled them to enter into better reflection and repentance. Israel repeatedly fails in these commands, and the problem isn't just that Israel isn't feeling it for God, but their effective failures, this is a quote from Hordern, their effective failures diminished their capacity for ethical reasoning. They were commanded to enter into joy, to apprehend again and remember again through their imaginations, through bodily actions, through community, the gifts that they had received from God and their relationship to him. The feasts were institutions which shored up effective political wisdom. To keep the feast was to keep the faith, but the effective emotion was incomplete without paying attention to the needs of others. And if you look at all in through the Bible, the Israelites are constantly commanded in their festivals to remember the poor, or what Nicholas Wolterstorff would refer to as the quartet of vulnerability. These would be the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant/refugee/sojourner/foreigner. The Israelites had to enter into joy to remember who they were, what gifts they had received, and who gave them the gifts. Transcendent joy, this is Hordern now, transcendent joy, joy in the Lord, is necessary to compassionate obligation. And I slapped this together, but what was weird is I was trying to find some sort of like kind of flannel graphy, picture of like Israelite worship, and typically I could only find like them worshiping Baal. It was hard to find. It was really hard to find an evocative picture. And then when I found this picture, I was like, well, that's worship. But then I found this picture, and I thought, the body postures to me are quite stunning. To see the posture of worship is also supplication, right? We're needy. We need God, and we're seeing the same thing with the hand of this child in need. Their animating joy in the Lord, coupled with remembering their own journeys of social vulnerability, was paired necessarily with addressing real needs in their community and for those on its margins. I'm keenly aware that I might be going over time at some point, so if you want to like drop a book or whatever, if I'm talking too much. Is everyone doing okay? Okay.
Julia runs the show.
Julia, you just get the hook and yank me off if I'm okay, right? So political emotions, political affections, these are terms that attempt to make sense of and account for our loving attachments, or lack thereof, to the people and places of our local or national belonging, how we emotionally participate in political affairs, or in common life with our neighbors, or in public life in general. So nope, not yet. I'll just leave it there. I'm sorry. I thought I had a, see? I thought I did. I must have forgotten to stick something on here. Okay. No, I'll leave it there. It's a nicer picture. Okay. So my deliberately awkward construction of democratic political community tries to account for the fact that this kind of relating can happen in all kinds of places, in churches, school classrooms, school boards, labor unions, housing associations. Ideally, in nations where we claim to prize democratic life as a gift, we also practice it, and we seek to foster, we seek to foster what the late Jean Bethke Elshtain referred to as democratic dispositions. Elshtain envisioned, and she uses that phrase in Democracy on Trial, she envisioned these dispositions as being cultivated in civic institutions in which members learn to deliberate and experience expressions of authority outside of themselves, to develop habits of the heart that draw us out of our narrow self-interests. Ideally, we learn to feel and think beyond ourselves in appropriate ways about our shared life. And then we seek to inculcate those effective dynamics for future generations. In other words, to pass along the gift of our shared life, which includes the responsibilities and obligations necessary for life in common. Looking back, as I knew Jean Elshtain, looking back as I have on some of her writing, much of her writing on the democratic dispositions were actually, she was quite dim about the prospects of democracy. She actually was not holding out much hope. And so these warnings have been there for some time. It's not super new. So in my reading, I have wondered if Christians in the West, and because we're in America, we're part of that, if Christians in the West actually cherish democratic political life and community as a received gift. If we do we see God as its giver? If we say that we love democracy, and increasingly the world, I've got to tell you, is wondering if we do, why do we? And how do we contribute, we as Christians, how do we contribute to its practices and maintenance, especially in these dispositions? How do we enter into its joys or enter into its sufferings, which is not to say getting more yelly and screamy, but to actually discover what it might mean to suffer there? Is there a witness that we Christians are called to bear in and about democratic political community that necessitates we cultivate our feelings for it? And to put this next question in a witty way, but it's a serious one, how do we cultivate emotions for democratic political community without a cult? That is, how do we feel these loving attachments to others without succumbing to false worship? How do we enter into these joys, take up those obligations, receive the gifts of this kind of community without succumbing to the risks of idolatry? Can we, in fact, sin against political communities, the relationships in which we have been placed, being born here, whatever, by failing to show them participatory affection, by failing to feel for them, suffer with them, by withdrawing from them, or holding them aloof in a blithe indifference? What does God want us to feel about our politics? How do our affective postures and dispositions shape our thoughts and our behaviors? And how does the relational reality of God in Christ matter in and for our political communities? I'll go there. That's nice. I think how we imagine these communities, specifically the operating metaphors and the stories we tell, matters a lot here. I suspect that when we imagine democracy merely in technical and tactical terms, as mere power mechanisms and processes, as instruments of cunning, we likely aren't feeling or thinking well about our shared life with our neighbors or in our nation. Worse, if the political space is replete with fantasy and heroic amusement, what we might call the circus, with entertaining diversions or despairing emotional overwhelm, we likely aren't even sure what it looks like to bear any meaningful witness to the relational realities of God in Christ in public life at all. So those are some of my very big questions and some of my half-lights of thought. Clearly, I'm very much in the midst of them, and I've thrown a lot of spaghetti on the wall, and it's going to get worse. My title for tonight, Prayer, Politics, and the Psalms, names the two horizons of relationship Jesus gives us in the great commandments of love, God and neighbor. Sometimes you hear that referred to as the vertical and the horizontal. I'm using prayer as a signifier for the vertical, politics as a signifier for the horizontal. Oh, I just said that. Sorry. I riffed it and I wrote it. Okay. Both are works of love that we are called to do by Christ. And that takes some effort and intention. Each relationship has sort of relational cells. And I put this up there. This is a monk in his cell. To use the metaphor of a monk cell, a place in which we remain in relationship even when it gets demanding or difficult. The Psalms, there's another relational cell. This is to signify like politics. It's people deliberating. It's another form of cell. The Psalms are prayers that put both of those relational horizons into emotional intelligibility for us and in our worship. The Psalms comprise the prayer book of the Bible, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer called it, and you all know that I've spent some time with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's thought. These are prayers that demonstrate deep, effective wisdom that accounts for the entire range of human emotion. And in Psalm 88, it is just darkness, and God does not rescue. There is hardly any joy. It is the psalm of despondency. It's a wonderful psalm to pray, actually, when you feel despondent. These prayer poems lift up a mirror in which we recognize ourselves as affective creatures and encounter a lot of affective commandments as well. One of the dominant commands of emotion in the Psalms is to rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord. Do it. Rejoice. Rejoicing is something we're expected to do, and the direction of the emotion, the object of joy, is the Lord. The Psalms also give voice to the depths of our laments, our fierce anger, our appetites for revenge, and these emotions receive guiding direction as well. With the psalmist, we face and direct our disappointments to God. We actually feel them. And we even address him with our disappointments with him. How distant he seems, how brief and pointless life feels, how the wicked get away with their wickedness, and the righteous seem like suckers for trying to be righteous. In those prayers that David and the other psalmists prayed, these same prayers that Jesus prayed, and when he died with psalms on his lips. These are words given to educate and exercise, and you could use it both ways, the spelling, exercise and exorcise. Exercise our emotions. We recognize our lonely, isolated selves in these prayers, and we also enter into the company of others, both in the witness that the scriptures represent, as well as the companionship of all those who have prayed and pray the Psalms today. Permit me here, I do have a picture of that. Permit me here to pause to say a little bit more about myself and my abiding interest in political theology, not as autobiography, but as testimony. My early fascination, and I said this in a political philosophy class today, my early fascination with both theology and political theory came about because I was compelled by their emotional resonances. That is, I recognized myself and my understanding of the world in both disciplines. Each of these intellectual fields helped me to think better about my feelings, to know myself, and to know God better because of them. Certainly, theology helped me to think about God in relationship to my feelings, like if I feel bad, depressed, anxious, fearful. What does it mean about me and about God? Do my feelings of sadness indicate that God is far from me or that I am far from God? My studies helped me to see that my intellect and my emotions hold hands and could work together when they acknowledged each other. And both my intellect and my affections deepened my prayers, informing how I know God and experience being known by God. And I found that dynamic to be true, weirdly, with political theory, but it was a more convoluted way. I was fascinated with early modern political thinkers because they had a view of human beings that I recognized as a Christian. The dark, low view of human nature. I am going to use the little buzzer. I'm going to try to point at it. Bam. Leviathan, that was fun. That was a first. In his Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan struck me as quite sound, even biblically and theologically coherent. Obviously, that's not because I was so deeply experienced in violent European religious wars, nor had I experienced anything close to a nasty, brutish, and short life. It was largely because Hobbes's view of human nature sounded a lot like what I was taught what human beings were like in church, that human beings were sinful, fundamentally depraved, and that apart from Jesus, people could not be trusted to be good for each other. And sometimes even with Jesus, they weren't all that good to each other. And they certainly were incapable of being good or good enough for God. Sin made it so that they couldn't be. That's the vision of the person and the requirements of community that ground Hobbes's fairly authoritarian social contract theory. Okay, do I have another picture on that? Not yet. It's tricky to talk about sin in our synapses, though, and before I do, I want to place a caveat. Acedia resembles and can coincide with depression. As conditions, they can be easily confused. And when we talk about acedia, it opens up for us a different angle from which to view our life. Acedia is slippery to diagnose, as I said. It takes discernment to identify because its symptoms are so varying, and I'll explain more about that in a bit. That is not usually the case with depression. Shaming thoughts like do better, try harder, pull it together, you're bad, really don't help anyone, and they definitely add a crushing load for anyone experiencing the burden of depression or anxiety, or who is vulnerable to ambient despair in society. Those thoughts, to say it quite plainly, are not the thoughts or voice of Jesus, whose yoke is easy and whose burden is light. So when I talk about these ideas as sin, as someone who has been depressed, who knows what that feels like, I was imagining myself sitting in the seat and thinking, oh, if someone told me that I was also being really sinful with this, that would feel really bad, and I would want to run. So that is not what I'm saying, to be clear. Okay, next slide now. That was my caveat. There are a lot of folks in popular culture these days who actually like to talk a lot about how to get unstuck from emotional pain and dissipation, like the stress and overwhelm and anxiety, and help people move towards a healthy and more flourishing life. There's a lot of wise teaching on these topics, as well as exciting research about them, and even how emotional pain can manifest in our bodies. I think a lot of our current fascination with habit cultivation, for instance, these are some really popular books. Fascination with habit cultivation in behavioral research and behavioral design demonstrates how powerfully our emotions and our thought life can govern our behaviors. Often we need only to make some small gestures of agency, a simple manual task, or getting clear by naming some kind of diffuse fear to feel some actual relief of emotional pain. Learning to think about pain, learning to think about it, how to interpret it, what to do about it can be very powerful tools that help a person recover a sense of themselves. Habit researchers demonstrate regularly that we don't necessarily have to get our emotional ducks in a row in order to make these kinds of life changes. Often we can make life changes and discover that we are changing our desires or shaping our emotional responses and directing them in new ways through habitual practices. But a lot of this current habit formation, and I gotta tell you, I like it. I think it's cool. I've read these books. A lot of it largely coalesces in projects of individual self-improvement. Again, that's not a bad thing. But the last thing I want to do is scold people, including myself, from personal growth. I think that's good. But they can be insufficient and incomplete because they center largely only on the self, particularly in terms of expressing moral responsibility. These habit formation projects often lack a meaningful vision for political relationships, for moral input about them, or what's good for us in those relationships as far as we're able to see. And I think what I have just described is what Bonhoeffer might call the view from above, a narrative of someone who takes for granted that democratic political community will largely serve me well and not fail to do me justice. Of course, it takes only a brief stroll through the Psalms to see that political communities regularly fail to administer justice, to uphold laws, to prevent corruption, or to address real human needs, which is what we try to do in politics. I think a lot of young people, and I'm putting you all in this, a lot of young people are shouldering heavy burdens of despair without many resources to equip them for some real ethical and political challenges. It doesn't help to tell young people to stop despairing or have hope, or to ignore what that despair represents. Is this an intelligible emotion? How can we evaluate it? I think some of the despair may communicate a sense of non-agency or very limited agency, a lack of hope about the future, and the end, and this is a big one, and the sensation of being wronged by the prior generation. Our world is facing huge challenges, from our persistent practiced refusals to rejoice in, care for, and steward God's creation, or in discerning how to live responsibly and repentantly in a world in which we are so much more connected to others than we can even imagine. A flourishing human life is a relational one, and our lives depend on others in ways we often fail to see or to give thanks to God for and others. And sin operates within those relationships and structures because human beings comprise them. As the Augustinian liberal political theorist Eric Gregory puts it, he's at Princeton, sin is always a part of human loving. So our theologies of sin, I think, matter to our political challenges. When it comes to making sense of sin, I've been greatly helped by two contemporary theologians of sin. The fancy word for that is hamartiology. Matt Jensen, who's also a friend of mine, so I'm not trying to advertise, but he's a nice guy.
Are the books for sale in the back?
Books are for sale in the back. That's right. Hopefully they're in your library. I think getting books into libraries is the best thing ever. Matt Jensen is a professor at the Torrey Honors College at Biola, and his dissertation, which he wrote a long time ago now, The Gravity of Sin. The subtitle there, it's hard to read, Augustine, Luther, and Barth on Homo incurvatus in se. That's a Latin expression for a man turned in on himself. The work also then of Alistair McFadden. He's at the Leeds, University of Leeds, especially in his books, The Call to Personhood, A Christian Theory of the Individual and Social Relationships, and Bound to Sin, which is his study in sin, abuse, Holocaust, and the Christian doctrine of sin. In that book, this is a bit of an aside, in that book, I'll just read what I wrote. Stop, I'll read it. McFadden holds that theology has a particular depth of knowledge about human pathologies that other intellectual disciplines cannot adequately, within their own vocabulary and methods, actually articulate. They get at it, they can try to describe pathologies, but they can't say sin because they don't have God in the discipline. And that's not, they should, have praise songs. It's to say God is not in the frame of reference. Theology, the great queen of the sciences, can continue to say God, even if no one is listening to it. They can continue to say God. I mean, you can say God in other disciplines too, but no one will take that seriously. That's not to say that there isn't insight for these other disciplines, but that theology alone can give intelligible witness to the righteous reality and the relational presence of God within those places of sinful violation. And what he does is he looks at child sexual abuse and the Holocaust, political collapse in the Holocaust, and particularly the sin that happened, not just the Germans against the Jews, but then what happened in camps and how the different power structures, how people survived in camps and who was complicit and who was less complicit. It's fascinating. And what he does is he takes these two examples to say, these are really easy cases. Like there's only monsters would say that this isn't really evil. So let's work with these as he illuminates his theory about how we actually talk about sin. Does that make sense? Okay. To say that human beings are sinful, which we are, is to say that we are turned in on ourselves. Nope, not yet. I wish I had a better picture. Oh well. We're turned in on ourselves, enclosed in self-evacuating and relationship-denying self-love. We are turned away from God and others. As Jensen puts it, the sinner is a person who tries to live without relationship, who lives as though she had no relations. That is curved in on herself. The sinner is one who lives as if reality were other than it is. And in so doing, she some water. She sits under judgment. We are all sinners. This isn't one person. It's all of us. To speak about human beings requires that we speak of sin. It's a necessary category of human personhood, and thus it's a necessary aspect of conversation about human relationships and political community. Aha, Hobbes is right. And this is what Hobbes gets wrong. It's not the truest word or the last word about human beings, because the first, truest, and last word about human beings is Jesus Christ. In him, we see what it means to be a person, both human and divine, the divine person. As Jensen puts it, drawing on John Zizioulis's thought, to be a human being is to be created and to be created for. We have a purpose. Ultimately, we humans are created for communion. Communion with the Father and the Son by the Spirit, for communion with one another and communion with ourselves. A sense of harmony and being at peace with ourselves, knowing ourselves. But democracy is not communion. And it's often hard to discern it even as community. As a political order, democracy holds out, I think, hopeful space for the possibility of community among people. It's possible to imagine in democracy a vision of human beings as bearers of God's image, which also takes sin seriously too. Democracy offers mechanisms for correction, ideally for some deliberation, for speech, because it retains at its core a vision of responsible human life or human personhood. Democracy holds space, but it's a space that must be kept. And our emotional participation matters to its keeping. That becomes especially difficult when we begin to think of when we think that the labors required for community aren't worth it. Many of the American founders, though, like other early modern thinkers to liberal democratic political order, saw human emotions and passions as dangerous and threatening, requiring sound virtue training, education, and governing constraints, like the constraint that was offered by religion. At least we had the fear of God. At least that would scare people enough. They wanted to draw on the best of human reason and contain and channel the primal turbulence and latent violence that were endemic to emotionally heated and spiritually debased crowds. They were both aware of and fearful of the violent stupidity of mobs. Democracy's weakness is not only that it is cumbersome and at times inefficient, but it also risks devolving into stupid mob rule that those who govern will be beholden to, pander to, and require ever-increasing levels of human stupidity to secure their rule. I'm using the phrase human stupidity in the way that Dietrich Bonhoeffer used it in After 10 Years, which is Corey still here? Did I see? No, or it's not Corey, Ori. Thank you. I just wanted to give a shout out to you. We had a really lovely discussion in our in the podcast interview that he did with me, and I read a passage from this particular text out loud. Sorry, Ori, to say your name. In After 10 Years, which is it was a letter that Dietrich wrote in 1942, months before he was arrested. He wrote this letter to some fellow conspirators. I actually probably wrote that, so I should just keep reading. He writes with vulnerability to these conspirators they were all together in this plot against the Nazi regime. He reflects on what they've learned after a decade of Nazi rule through a series of short reflections on various topics, and one of them is on stupidity. I read on optimism, right? Wasn't it about that? In the political realm, people can allow themselves to be made stupid, and it can be quite infectious, and it is far more dangerous, Bonhoeffer said, than malice. Powers can come to depend on others' stupidity, and this dynamic, this sort of morbid codependency that emerges politically, truly threatens and jeopardizes human life. We cannot simply reason with the stupid. And what he would say is that that doesn't mean that they're not highly educated. The stupid is someone who has in some sense ceded their personhood. They've stopped thinking. I think they've also stopped feeling. Bonhoeffer says there's hope for liberation from it. Usually it has to come after a kind of external liberation, but it also requires internal liberation. And you can't engage in endless argumentation to get there. But he also says, and this is also really important, we're not permitted to deploy the concept of stupidity as a form of contempt for other human beings. That would actually violate their personhood. That would actually deny to them the possibility that they could not be stupid, that they could actually emerge from this, right? We have to hold out hope that they will return to their senses. I have wondered if the stupidity that Bonhoeffer talks about might be a symptom of acedia, especially in political communities. So now let's at last, see, I'm rounding the bend. Let's give some proper attention to this Greek word and what it means. I first learned the term from the writer and poet Kathleen Norris in her memoir, Acedia and Me. It's not her best work, but it's interesting. In it, she introduces Evagrius Ponticus, a desert monk in the 4th century who identified and described the 8 evil thoughts, acedia being the worst of them. Although in Evagrius's taxonomy, it's number 6, but he would still say it's the worst. And acedia as a bad thought, a logos moi is what the Greek word is, a bad thought. The demon suggests it, right? There's a demon that comes to a monk and suggests this thought. It plagued solitary religious desert dwellers in their devotion to God. Norris was surprised to find help and even a renewed sense of agency by being able to name this psychic malaise that she had been aware of for much of her life. The remedies Evagrius and others identify, perseverance, staying put, staying in one's cell, gave her real help, actually, not only in her writing work, which she is a prolific writer, but also in her marriage. She distinguishes evocatively and not so much analytically between her periodic experiences with depression and how acedia operates differently in her life. In these diagnoses, she saw how she would participate with these bad thoughts, allowing them to paralyze and stultify her. In the remedies, she found real action steps, things to do, to refuse to succumb to despair and make steps towards joy. Norris's story demonstrates, 1, the importance of having a name for these sensations, thoughts, and moods. 2, the possibility that we can learn to recognize and evaluate what we might be experiencing as an emotion. And I think typically we think of emotions as being absolutely governable, like they govern us. If I feel it, I feel it, I'm helpless, right? And then 3, to take meaningful action, even if it's very small, to recover her capacity to care. The ancient Greeks used the term acedia or Acadia, but it gains a much richer spiritual understanding in the early Christian desert monasticism. The word means not caring, without care, and it's closely related to torpor and inertia. We get a sensation of this in a Qumran document. It was one of their rules of life. The Manual of Discipline refers to a slackening of hands in the service of righteousness. It's a profound atonality. Imagine you're a muscle and it goes, bleh, right? Like nobody's exercising, or who cares, right? Evagrius and these other desert solitaries left cities to commit to prayer in imitation to Jesus in the wilderness. And there they discovered that while they had left one realm replete with temptation and sin, they had entered yet another in the desert, one with far fewer distractions and amusements. Their stripped-down life of desert devotion opened them up even more to strident attacks by these demons with their bad thoughts. And Evagrius uses the word bad thought and demon interchangeably, and he wasn't interested in getting all like, let's name demons, and that. He's just trying to say they're out there, and just, they're out there, so deal. Acedia tempted them to abandon their cells, to despair about the passing of time, to sleep, to become idle spiritually and physically. Acedia represented almost a last battle for these holy men and women, dissipating one's resolve, strength, attention, and suffusing the sufferer with dissatisfaction and melees about their life. This Noonday Demon, which is a phrase taken from Psalm 91, was bold enough to attack in broad daylight, in the heat of the day. Identifying it and refusing to give it cooperation was critical. But when despondency took hold and inner restlessness would drive the afflicted soul into torment, everything that's available to us, we don't want it. Everything that's unavailable to us is desirable. So listen to Evagrius. The demon of Acedia, which is also called the Noonday Demon, is the most burdensome of all the demons. It besets the monk at about the 4th hour, 10 a.m. of the morning, encircling his soul until about the 8th hour, 2 p.m. This is the desert. That's the hot time. First, it makes the sun appear to slow down or stop, so the day seems to be 50 hours long. He really wrote that. Then it forces the monk to keep looking out the window and rush from his cell to observe if the sun is in order and to see how much longer it is until the 9th hour, 3 o'clock, which is when they got to eat. And to look about in every direction in case any of the brothers are there. Is anybody else out there? Like, are we doing this? Then it assails him with hatred of his place, his way of life, the work of his hands. Often they were braiding baskets, and they would sell them to make a little bit of money. That love has departed from the brethren. Like, nobody's doing this anymore. Like, no one's really holding up the cause. And the experience that he has no one to console him. If anyone has recently caused this monk grief, the demon adds to this as well to amplify the monk's hatred of these other people. It makes him desire other places where he can easily find all that he needs and practice an easier, more convenient craft. After all, pleasing the Lord is not dependent on geography. The demon adds, God is to be worshipped everywhere. It combines this with remembrance of his relatives, all the people that knew him, that really knew him and loved him, and his former way of life. It depicts to him a long life, placing before his eyes a vision of the burdens of the ascetic life. This is it. This is all I've got ad infinitum. It employs, as they say, I'm really spitting a lot, employs, as they say, every possible means to move the monk to leave his cell and flee to the race course, which let's call that Twitter. Let's call that it doesn't have to just be your phone, anything that will get me numb from this. No other demon comes immediately after this one. Rather, Evagrius says, after the struggle, the soul receives in turn a peaceful state and an unspeakable joy. There's a kind of, you got to hold on, but then you break through and the demon leaves, the bad thought dissipates, and you enter into joy. So what did Evagrius recommend in the struggle? Staying put, persevering, continuing in prayer, especially the prayers of the Psalms. This is my last slide. We're almost there. The Psalms offer us words to recover our sense of belonging to communities and to God. And it's a waging. The Psalms, they were like, pray a psalm, and the demon will flee. There's one story on this, is they wouldn't just flee. The temptation was to have them to stop praying the Psalms. And there's a really funny story of a monk who has been picked up. Obviously, these are kind of metaphoric, but a monk who's been picked up by demons as being tossed in the air, and he continues to pray. He will not be released from the demand, but he's being completely tormented. These ancient prayers look squarely at life's pain, as we've talked about, naming fears, identifying feelings of revenge, sorrow, woe over the madness of how the world works. They name entrenched communal injustices. They beg for a sign that there's more to life than this. They ask God where God is and whether God has forsaken us. They offer us a constructive mirror of our human condition, a means by which to name and face our emotions, a place in which our emotions can be evaluated, even educated, certainly exercised and exorcised in perseverance and in prayer. They help us to care deeply in the presence of God. They take the self-enclosing tendencies to despair and place them before the Lord. There was therapeutic value from the Psalms. The Psalms ameliorated the individual's vulnerability to the passions, and they would make Christ's own life present to them. The Psalms answered back. They talked back to the demons. So, last thing, what does this have to do with political community? Final observations. Acedia is the temptation to sin by avoiding the demands of love. It's characterized by despairing resignation or desperate escapism, and is thus notoriously Janus-faced. It can present as inactivity or negligence, but it can also present as distracted, preoccupied hyperactivity. Indeed, being busy with religious activity is actually a way of avoiding the real demands of love. It's actually a very classic form of acedia at work. The vice is known to cloak itself in the appearance of virtue, whether a virtue that's sort of lethargic or misplaced activity. I suspect that our politics of resentment, despairing resignation, and distraction, desperate escapism, along with a growing tide of anger and bitterness, will continue to tempt us. Are Christians of any use here? Are we making any difference? And if so, what and how? Is democracy a gift to be gratefully received, a common good of God, or do we avoid loving it? If we do, how do we avoid it? Is our ambivalence, our cynical distance to its plights, or our religious or theopolitical hyperactivity a symptom of the sin of despair? If God has called us to love our political communities, how do we enter into that suffering joy in a way that appropriately cultivates affection? And to this I would say, who do we hold in contempt? What forms of speech, what kinds of speech do we contribute? Is it contemptuous? What might we need to fast from in order to better hear God's voice and the voices of others? What I want us to do as Christians is to recover the Psalms as a book of common prayer, and not to do it as a grand movement or program, and not to do it for politics. No. What if we prayed the Psalms as a hidden work of love on behalf of our neighbors, like the monks did? What effective political wisdom is available to us in these prayers? What emotional evaluations might we discover that our neighbors and the vulnerable around us need us to make? What ethical demands are we avoiding because we are not willing to suffer love's pain? And then, last question, what joys might we recover? What tastes of peace, renewed personhood, even glimpses of community and a sense of hope for the next generation? What might God want for us and for our neighbors that would be hopeful? That's the end. Thank you very much.
How close where should I be in order to be on the live stream? If you're on the live stream, Slido is 835-767, 835-767. I think we can, do you have 10 or 15 minutes so we could field some questions?
Definitely.
While you're thinking of questions, and I think that you don't have to do this. Is it okay if they don't do the Slido? Because it's
Yes.
reverberant enough space that I think you could raise your hand.
I'll call you out if you do something weird.
So,
I'm not going to answer.
Do you mind if I start with the first
I would love
question?
it.
So so one of the things that I heard you say that was really helpful was acedia is a defection from love.
Yes.
And you mentioned Oliver O'Donovan, and he talks about how Augustine redefined Cicero's definition of republic as a republic is common objects of love.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering about how do I know? Do I get a chair too, Julia? Or okay, good.
Do you mind if I stand? I'm so energized by standing. Is
yeah,
that all right?
I'll stand too. Yeah.
Okay.
Or do like acrobatics.
It's a real.
So common objects of love. So acedia could be a defection from political acedia would be a defection from the common objects of love.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether or not part of our problem is that we have if you're talking about the United States or even a smaller polis like JBU, we actually have competing ideas about our common objects of love.
Yes.
So if I say America is this, and you tell me, especially if you're in a position of authority, I say America, it's A, B, and C, and you say it's not A, it's not B, it's not C, instead of it's D, E, and F, then I may experience some defection of love because I actually think, well, maybe either you're wrong, and so you're defecting from the common objects of the common objects of love, or you're right, but my heart's desire for the republic or the polis or whatever, that I'm now it's destabilizing.
Yes.
So what should be my response to that? I'm thinking even for a JBU student, you come to JBU, it's your freshman fall, you're like, yeah, and then you go, whoa, hold on.
Right.
Now,
how would I answer this? So I agree with you, and I think this is why I asked the question, how do we actually cultivate kinds of love, maybe we could say proximate loves, without actually having worship? Because ideally our love is moving in the direction of what we worship. And it's tempting when you hear someone say, well, I worship A, B, C. They might not say worship, but no, A, B, and C is the thing. That's what I want. I think as Christians, this is where our capacity to be peacemakers, first of all, we are freed from ensuring that we know that we will not finally enact the kingdom of God fully, and so we are freed to find proximate solutions to things. We are actually equipped to discover ways where we might actually have some common love, to discover, well, okay, can we agree on this point, or can we drill this down a bit further so I'm actually understanding what you love and what is the value there? So I think in a lot of our very heated debates, we are actually trying to figure out how to kind of keep things stable but also authentic. And there are people that have been hit hard by maybe not being misunderstood. They've been misunderstood, they've not been heard at all, or they simply do not hold the same view. I know this is a big issue on sexuality. So there's been debates about how do we actually answer, how do we have stable sexual relationships where people actually are committing to one another in love. I think Christians obviously are disagreeing about this. I think that there are things that we can affirm that will look different. I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think naming them and understanding the values of people that might be very different than us, we can be equipped to do that because we're equipped by the love of God. Like, we don't have to solve them. We need to pay attention to who God is in their life, or how God might be providing for them, how we might find ways that we can commonly work together on things. I don't have an easy answer for that.
So either I have failed you on Slido with 835767, or you have
Or I
failed
talked
me.
a long time.
So why don't we have two more questions, and then we'll wrap things
You don't
up.
have to.
Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
I love this whole concept. It's really cool. Something in my work with impacting in politics is I'm like, how do I translate a Christian ideology into a secular world? And so like, as I'm listening to you, I'm like, what a beautiful point. How do we hold the tension of a secular society that doesn't want to engage in the joy of democracy when we ourselves are called to rectify the world in that way? Like, how do we hold that?
How do we, make sure I understood the question. How do we communicate our Christian faith, or what did you mean by ideology?
Like, we, from this talk, right, we
Yeah.
want to engage in the joy and celebration of democracy. Like, we love to
Yes.
want to hold this together as a community. How do we get our brothers and sisters on board that don't share the faith? How do we infect,
Yes.
for lack of a better word, our political surrounding in that way?
Yeah. So one is, I don't know if we do cherish democracy. I actually am not sure that Christians actually see that as a gift. I'm not convinced of it. I don't see a whole lot of celebration about it. I think we take it for granted. I think if we actually showed I don't know, when we say Christians, it's a little hard. It's like there's a lot of different Christians out there. But I think in the main, if everybody's lumping people together and be like the Christians in America, like, I don't know if people are actually hearing that we care about democracy. I actually think mostly they think we don't. I think we show a lot of interest in jujitsu and power politics, but just slapping a bumper sticker on it that's like, I have a fish on my bumper sticker, like that. I really do. And so actually, I think there's some of it is language learning. When I actually talked about what I'm studying with my completely atheist neighbors, and I do so absolutely forthrightly. I mean, like, as a Christian, I believe this, and I think this about what it means to be a person, and that I owe you recognition of your humanity. And they're like, yeah, that's right. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can do. Just say it as a Christian. Just say, as a Christian, this is what I think. I might not convince a person to get in the Christian car. But I could give them a ride and kind of introduce them to say, like, well, as a Christian, this is what I think. And they can be like, well, I can get behind those things. And you're like, great, well, let's work on those things. And I think that I think us recovering, which is why I'm excited about your project, is I think Christians have been on the forefront of compassion. I think we have a ton of institutional memory about it. All the really elegant contributions of much vaunted Western civilization, hospitals, universities, Christians did it. I mean, this is what we did. And offering the cups of cool water. So it's not going to look like evangelism. It will look like testimony. And you just let God do what God needs to do.
Yeah, quick interjection. I once heard a lecture. I was lecturing, and then this other guy was lecturing, and for some reason the lecture was Islam 101. And he began it by saying, I'm a Muslim, and I want every person in this room to be a Muslim.
Yes.
And as a sincere Christian, I found it refreshing.
Totally.
Here's a guy who really believes it. So I think that is helpful. All right, time for one last question. Come on, be brave. Yep, good.
This question will be formed as it is said. So.
Awesome. Great.
I was thinking about kind of American political life. Obviously, 2020 there was a lot of strife, and I kind of got to the point for me where I was like, there's a lot of people I was in good community with, but I was like, I am not going to give up on like this relationship, and I was like made that effort, and it was just like exhausting.
Yes.
And now that we are through this, and it's like it's still like everyone's kind of getting rubbed the wrong way every once in a while, but it's like it is so much easier to avoid those types of conversations. And like I feel like I have a lot better relationship with them now just because this one thing is not like ever present above us. But I also feel like, listen to what you said, I feel like there might be in some sense sort of like Acedia there, and like I've been kind of like just complacent in that and realizing like, hey, we don't need to talk about these things. So like, where does Acedia come in where it's like, at what point do we not talk about things in order to keep relationship?
Yes.
Or like, how do you balance those two ideas?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think what's disappointing, I think, especially when you experience these kinds of political points of tension, ideally politics is happening like the sausage making. Ideally, it's being done with a kind of responsibility that you're not having to like stare at it constantly, and that people who need to be heard are being heard. That's the ideal. And I think some of the despair is that we're trying to get everybody on our side on a lot of things, and at times I think it is okay, and this is where discerning acedia is actually really important. And it's probably better not to be just looking under the stone and being like, is this acedia? Like, is this the demon? Maybe thinking at times, am I avoiding something in this relationship that I might need to say? Or is there a way that I could actually offer a kind of like advanced repair? Is there a way that I could actually anticipate investing in ways in a relationship just to continue to demonstrate my humanity? I have a couple relationships right now that I have been feeling quite convicted on, that I need to ask forgiveness, and I have there are a couple people, and I need to let go of some hatred. And that's actually what the beauty of having the category of sin is, that there's repentance, and it's not just that I have to figure out my mood, and I also don't necessarily have to, the relationship might not be the same, but I know that the work in my heart that needs to happen is to let go of that kind of hatred, contempt. And then to hold out with joy. And this is where I do think prayer, I know that sounds like pious flight, but praying the Psalms, Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say in his book that prayer is not the simple pouring of our hearts out to God. We actually have to learn how to do it. And we are given the words in the Psalms so that we can. And I have prayed the Psalms now for years. I even spent a year hand copying them each day, like portions. Once you get to 119, it's really discouraging because it's long. But taking time to enter into those words and really seeing all the political imagery, it's a ton. It's like, put the kings, lop off their heads, smash babies on rocks. Like, there's a lot of really visceral stuff in it. And I think giving God some of that really visceral stuff will equip us to kind of let go of it when we're in some of those more difficult conversations. You have prayed about the baby smashed on rocks, right? You have, like, the enemies, you have given them to God, and you are not actually smashing their babies on rocks. And you can let that be, and pick up the task again. Pick it up. Because you've given this to God, you have. And so I'm sorry, I'm like, just pray. But that's kind of my answer right now. I mean, this is when I argued this morning in chapel about we forget where true power lies. We do. we forget. And we have to keep remembering, and I think we can anticipate that God will hear us. I don't think there's going to be a grand movement. And I definitely don't think that there should be any prayer meetings on the National Mall. I think all of those spectacles are the opposite of what we need. I think we need people hidden away praying and doing compassionate work humbly and earning the opportunity perhaps to say, well, I do this in the name of Jesus. This is why I do it.
That's great. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you to you.
That's wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Julia will taser me if you don't go and sign up for your chapel credit. So please do that. Oh, now she's moved over there.